He may or may not be meeting Kim, but yesterday Trump met Kim. Kim Kardashian. If someone had shown you that headline, together with the subject matter discussed, prison reform, if someone had shown you the headline just 3 years ago, President Donald Trump meets Kim Kardashian in the White House to discuss prison reform, as someone pointed out on Twitter this morning, the chances of your believing that would be zero. But then again, with Donald Trump, expect absolutely anything. Expect anything. And they are rising like Lazarus in the era of President Putin. You really couldn't make up the headlines from yesterday. All the neocon froths were out and raging that the Russians had murdered another Kremlin critic. With apologies to William Shakespeare, the brave man dies only once. The Kremlin critic dies many times before his death. It was all fake news. Nobody killed the Russian dissident journalist in Kiev. Nobody laid a finger on him. Least of all, President Putin. It was fake news. And given the gangsterism, Wild West, foaming at the mouth racism and anti-Semitism, currently running wild on the streets of the Ukraine, where Ukraine's remaining Jews are literally locking themselves into their houses because the followers of Adolf Hitler are running the show. They're on the streets in their thousands, wearing swastikas, Sieg Heiling, jackbooting. That's the kind of place the Ukraine is now. Well, given all that, nothing surprises coming out of Kiev. What is utterly damning, unanswerably damning, is the immediate Pavlovian jerk to judgment of the Western media, particularly the so-called liberal media. I mean, not only should you never confuse me with a liberal, I've got to tell you, I hate liberals with a small L more than I hate anybody else. The Guardian leapt into print, not just accepting the gangster fake news of an assassination that never happened, was entirely fabricated, but going immediately on to the offensive. The faded fop, Michael White, asked in The Guardian how long before the usual suspects, did he mean me and people like me, the usual suspects would leap into counter-accusation, blaming this, that, and the next person or organization for this dastardly crime? Or would we, he asked, choose complicit silence? A period of silence from Michael White would have saved him some embarrassment this morning. The BBC, the once famous, trusted, global news source of first choice, didn't even check if the man was dead before they were assailing. They were accusing another state, another president, of having ordered the hit that never was. I honestly thought the Skripal story would be difficult to top. But the story from the Ukraine yesterday is the number one. It takes the biscuit. And all these foaming at the mouth Russophobes didn't miss Jeremy Corbyn. One of them on Twitter has become a famous think, centrist dad, he's called. He went right on to the attack. And do you know what he said? Corbyn will be demanding all the evidence before he agrees to point the finger at Putin. At least he had the grace later to delete that foolish statement, unlike Michael White, unlike the BBC. This poses a big, big question, dear listeners. If the Ukraine could fake the death of the Russian journalist yesterday, what else have they faked? If there's organophosphates in the air, if there's deadly Novichok in the air, if there's military-grade nerve agents in the air, the Ukraine has got them too. As a former important part of the ex-Soviet military-industrial complex, there is nothing that the Ukraine doesn't have. And as we can now see all too clearly, it's not true, Mrs. May, that only Russia had a motive for attacking the Skripals. The Ukraine had a motive for attacking the Skripals and blaming it on Putin, as they did yesterday when they faked the murder of a dissident Russian journalist. And how is he a dissident, by the way? Because he openly welcomed the death in a crash of 92 members of the Red Army Choir. He openly laughed he did, at the beheading of a Russian in the hands of ISIS in Syria. He's hated in Russia, to be sure. But killing him in Kiev, just like killing the Skripals in Salisbury, would serve Russia less than it would serve those who wish to damage, smear Russia as it builds up less than a fortnight from now to the World Cup 2018. So I'm asking, how many other of Putin's crimes have been carried out, in fact, by others, and in fact, by the Wild West gangster, Nazi, anti-Semite state of Ukraine? And I say this with all sincerity as someone who loves Kiev, one of the world's greatest cities. These endless provocations by Ukraine against Russia cannot end well. They must end badly. And sensible people in Ukraine must already know that. I'll be talking to Dr. John Nielsen Wright, Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia at Chatham House, lecturer in International Relations at Cambridge University, the fourth best university in the entire world. I've always been a supporter of Cambridge versus Oxford and the exchanged places in the world ranking tables. Cambridge is up to 4, Oxford down to 5. Dr. John Nielsen Wright will talk to me about Kim and Trump, and I don't mean Kardashian. And it's an all-points alert for Andrew O'Hagan. Andrew O'Hagan, writing in the London Review of Books, has produced, as he always does, many thousands of very powerful words, analyses and accusation on the Grenfell towering inferno. He comes to some surprising conclusions that I very much wanted to talk to him about. Unfortunately, he's not available for any interviews, even turning down Channel 4 News, his publicist just told us, perhaps especially Channel 4 News. Because who does Andrew O'Hagan blame? for what happened in the aftermath of the Grenfell Tower slaughter, he blames Jon Snow, described in the Daily Mail as a left-wing television reporter. Could have fooled me. Jon Snow apparently was the one who whipped up class hatred and resentment and fatally skewed the narrative over the Grenfell disaster. Who does Andrew O'Hagan exculpate? Mr. Paget Brown, the Tory head of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea Council, who resigned a couple of weeks after the disaster. He shouldn't have, according to Andrew. He's entirely blameless. The council, entirely blameless. Who does he blame for the disaster itself? Well, don't you know? Andrew O'Hagan blames the fire brigade. That's right, the firefighters. The ones who ran into the flames. The ones who didn't have the right breathing apparatus to reach above the 10th floor. The ones who didn't have the right ladders to get beyond the 10th floor. The ones who didn't have helicopters to rescue people off the roof. The fire brigade, whose fire stations had been completely, savagely, nearly demolished. In that area, 4/5 of firefighting resources had been lost in the last 5 years. And who does Andrew O'Hagan blame for all of that? He blames the fire brigade. Their switchboard was down in London. Calls were being redirected all across the country. Who does he blame for that? O'Hagan blames the fire brigade. He blames the fire brigade for failing to control and evacuate scores of scorched, incinerated, dead people. No wonder you're not making yourself available for interview, Mr. Andrew O'Hagan. Fantastic music choice. The Very Far From Average White Band. Many of them from my own home city of Dundee, picking up the pieces of one of the biggest stories of this or any other year. I'm talking about the fake assassination. 7 bullets in the back. His wife apparently not in on the secret. And he apologised to her for having her come upon him lying on the floor of his hallway with 7 bullets in his back and fake blood running everywhere. Arkady Babchenko, the Russian Kremlin critic who was murdered in Kiev yesterday, and instant judgment, of course, was delivered. It was delivered by President Putin and by Russia, just as instantly as the judgment on Salisbury, and maybe with the same level of credibility, because less than 24 hours after having been found by his wife dead on the floor, Babchenko was alive and well. Like Lazarus, he had risen from his tomb. So we're picking up the pieces of this story, not just about, I'm actually less interested in, because nothing that the Ukrainian regime, the coup regime in Kiev would do is beyond comprehension for me. What I'm more interested in is how every securocratic fink, every puffed up popinjay in the British media, in The Guardian, in the BBC, immediately, without even checking if the story had any scintilla of truth, leapt into action like the very most obedient of Pavlov's dogs The dogs of war were already unleashed, were salivating, were headed for their target. Yeah? When, lo and behold, the man popped up at a press conference saying it had all been a joke. Russell Davis says Bill Browder, just on a local London radio station, with a new book about his history with Putin. He described Salisbury exactly as per May and Johnson, military grade, etc. Typically skipped over and no further comment made, not even about the Skripals being alive. Well, as I said to you, Russell, in the age of Putin, the dead rise like Lazarus. Fra says, George, there are legitimate concerns over how the fire brigade handled the Grenfell fire. People were encouraged to stay in place and not try to escape, possibly exacerbating the death toll. These questions need addressed, especially if it exonerates the brigade. We're trying to get Andrew O'Hagan, we're trying to get someone from the brigade. Everyone has gone to ground. Ian Parker says, who is this guy on Talk Radio? He loves himself, doesn't he? What happened to the usual guy? Holiday, I guess. Turning off now. Bye. Bye, Ian. And Bass Players Union says, George, I have 2 electricians working on my house today. I've told them it's essential they listen to your show as part of entrance to my house. One of them isn't totally convinced yet, but I'm working on him. That's my own union, by the way. I'm a double bass player myself. And Alicia says, good morning, George. Looking forward to the next 3 hours. They're rising like Lazarus. My favourite quote of the week. Thank you, Alicia. And Russell says, it's a hoax. The Russians didn't shoot him. He's alive. Again. May's putrid army of misfits, the press, media, and the BBC falsely accuse, reports, flat-out lies. The Russians have shown superior restraint and one-upmanship. What Putin going to be blamed for next? Don't keep crying wolf. Julianne Davis says, I'm done with you. You, Gigi, are part of what is destroying the West. And shame on Talk Radio for giving anyone with your views a platform. Islam will destroy the West, and you are rolling out the red carpet for it to happen. Disgusting. Who is this? Julianne Davis. Why don't you call me Julianne Davis? 0344 499 1000. And Time for Change says, George, you make a great point. The Ukraine are overlooked as potential agents provocateurs. The Ruskies are often painted as the bad guys, but there are also plenty of people who are out to frame them too. My goodness, the waters are troubled. The Ukraine is in a state of fervor with hatred against its former close partner, Russia. It's ready to stage any provocation against Russia. I understand that. I even understand the Ukrainian point of view in relation to Big Brother Russia. What I don't understand is how virtually the entire British media went to war yesterday on a murder of Babchenko that never actually happened. Now, one man who knows the region well is the Honourable Craig Murray, former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, itself also a former republic of the Soviet Union, and he's been opining about this story and, of course, was the obvious man to turn to. Your Excellency, Mr. Murray, thanks very much for joining us. Tell me, first of all, were you surprised at the apparent news of the murder of this man? Did you reach the Pavlovian instant conclusion that Putin had done in yet another critic?
No, I wasn't surprised in that, unfortunately, the internal political and economic disputes of the former Soviet Union are violent, and people end up getting killed far too often, including journalists. But to apportion all the blame of that at the door of the Kremlin, especially somewhere like Ukraine, which is itself an extremely, extremely corrupt country with its own internal violence and feuding going on, to immediately blame it on the Kremlin without any obvious evidence was plainly worrying. So, the idea that he might be dead wasn't particularly surprising, and I was sorry if he were killed. But I certainly didn't leap to say Putin has killed him.
Because just like with the Skripal case, just before the World Cup, what possible motive would Putin have to kill somebody in Kiev, knowing what the inevitable backlash across the world would be?
Yeah, there are plenty of people who might have had a motive to attack Babchenko had it been a real attack, including, of course, in Chechnya, where he served at one stage of the Russian army, and on which he's reported, and where he made a lot of enemies. And the gangster politics of Chechnya are extremely complicated. So to automatically blame Putin was daft. But the problem is, similarly with the Skripals, we have seen no evidence whatsoever, none, not one single piece of evidence has been produced to say that Putin or the Kremlin was behind the apparent attack on the Skripals. But we are moving into a very intense phase of Cold War, which of course is being used by those in the armaments industry and the security services and the supporters of the armed forces to argue for huge budget increases. We've heard a Tory minister recently applying the idea that we should spend an extra 0.5% of GDP on defense spending, ramping us up to being one of the developed countries that spends most on defense in the world, all against this rather imaginary danger. And that danger is unattributed assassinations or assassinations attributed to the Kremlin that can't be proved. Apparently there's a massive cyber danger, and apparently people like you and I are part of the danger that has to be defended against, because we question sometimes what's happening. And anybody who questions anything is automatically smeared as part of this Russian attack on the UK. It really is quite crazy. It's McCarthyite, it's witch hunting, and the mainstream media appears in large part to have taken leave of its senses. You're a very rare voice with broadcast access, casting doubt on some of this. But the thing that strikes me most, and I was looking today at comments on newspaper websites, some newspapers like the Daily Mail and the Telegraph, and places which are not hotbeds of radicalism, and they show quite plainly that the majority of the public are not actually buying in to this strange narrative, and that things like the Babchenko case and the Skripal case are not accepted by ordinary people as definitive proof of some great Russian plot against Britain.
Now, you were a Foreign Office man for decades. Boris Johnson was amongst those in the mass Pavlovian reaction. And that's the second time in a week that the British Foreign Secretary has been hoaxed, thinking he was talking for 18 minutes to the new Prime Minister of Armenia and saying and not contradicting very many very injudicious things. And now this. What kind of Foreign Office have we got nowadays? What kind of intelligence agencies have we got nowadays? Does the Foreign Secretary of Great Britain now just look at the BBC website and dash off his pronunciamento?
That appears to be the case, and it's extremely injudicious. And if you recall, Boris Johnson was blaming the Kremlin in the Skripal case the very day it happened. He immediately came out and said this was Putin. And he said also that the nerve agent was made in Russia. It turned out that Portendan couldn't say the nerve agent was made in Russia. The OPCW couldn't say that the nerve agent was made in Russia. But Johnson doesn't wait. He's entirely injudicious. And my favorite piece of social media in this whole Babchenko affair was yesterday from some Tony Blair supporting people who put out a tweet.
My goodness, talk about bated breath. I was waiting for that Tony Blair with bated breath. We'll get Craig back on the line. Fra adds, I'm not blaming the fire brigade for the fire at Grenfell, nor the heroism of the firefighters. The council ultimately bears corporate responsibility for the deaths in their building. But it is legitimate to ask how the fire brigade responded operationally. We've got Honourable Craig Murray back on the line. Craig, thanks. Don't know what happened there. You were about to tell us what this Tony Blair supporter tweeted.
Yes, he tweeted, I bet that Corbyn will say we should wait for evidence again.
Indeed, this was the now infamous centrist dad, who is very far from centrist, of course. These people define the spectrum to suit themselves. Yes, Corbyn will be demanding evidence. Probably would have been a good idea for Boris Johnson to do so also. Now, I want to ask you a more serious question. If, as we now know, no speculation now about it, if, as we now know, the Ukraine are capable of mounting provocations to cause problems for Russia, how many other of Russia's crimes could actually have been provocations mounted by, say, the Ukraine?
Well, of course, it's perfectly possible. In the case of the Skripals, the Ukraine is one of a number of countries that could have been behind the attack in order to frame Russia. And of course, the Ukraine was part of the former Soviet Union. It is certainly, I can tell you 100% for certain, that at the Soviet chemical weapon testing base in Nukus in Uzbekistan, where I was posted and which I visited after it had been dismantled, that Ukrainian scientists were working in Soviet days in senior positions at that Soviet chemical weapons testing facility. So there's no doubt at all that Ukrainian security services must be one of the suspects in the Skripal case. I'd also say that the Ukrainian security services are not exactly gentle people. And I think almost certainly we are going to find that the gentleman they have in custody, who they claim is the Kremlin agent who attempted to organize an assassination, will be made to confess in rather unpleasant ways. So expect in the next few days to have a lot of propaganda about how it has now been proved that the Kremlin was behind this assassination plot.
Now, I advise you, if you haven't already, to read the faded fop Michael White, the superannuated Guardian journalist's piece, in which I think he meant us, as the usual suspects would be lining up to blame all kinds of other people for the assassination that never happened. There's been a veritable dripping roast for us to laugh at, but I promise you'll laugh at that one most heartily. Craig Murray, former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, joining us here on the mother of all talk shows. That's the boss, Dancing in the Dark, Can't Start a Fire Without a Spark. He also did a fantastic one on an album called The Rising, maybe we can look for it, called Into the Fire, which was a tribute to the New York City Fire Department and their heroic efforts to rescue people from the Twin Towers on 9/11, 2001, one of my all-time favourite Springsteen tracks. And we're playing that, of course, because I am mightily offended on behalf of the London firefighters who ran into the fire at Grenfell, but who have been afforded the number one culpability in the disaster 1 year ago. We haven't yet found anyone from the fire service who'll answer Andrew O'Hagan's attack on the fire brigade and its role. But if we can't, then it'll just be me and Bruce Springsteen. Now, nowadays, because I have a young wife, I do an hour of exercise every single day because my wife is determined to keep me alive for longer. And therefore, I was immediately attracted to a report by Oliver Moody, the science correspondent in the Times, a very fine science correspondent too, who shares this. As little as an hour a week of any kind of physical activity can reverse mental decline in older people. He goes on, older people who have lapsed into a sedentary lifestyle can reverse their mental decline with as little as 52 hours of exercise a year. Scientists believe that almost any kind of physical activity, from yoga and Tai Chi to running and cycling, will lead to tangible cognitive benefits if it can be kept up for long enough. Their analysis of 98 studies involving more than 11,000 people aged over 60 found that sustained exercise brought measurable improvements in concentration, processing speed, and problem solving, even for people with dementia. It's very, very well worth reading the entire piece. But we're lucky that Dr. Dawn Harper, not just a doctor, but of course an eminent broadcaster too, has found the time to join me here this morning. Dr. Dawn, thanks for that.
Oh, thank you, George. It's a pleasure.
Now, a very wise old friend of mine, a German couple, once imparted the wisdom to me about retirement, not that I'm in any danger of retirement, that if you rest, you rust. In a way, that's what this survey is saying, isn't it?
I think that's probably it, absolutely in a nutshell. You know, if you don't lose it, if you don't use it, you lose it. And I think very interestingly, I mean, I look across my patients. I'm a practicing NHS GP, and I have for many years now seen a massive difference in chronological age and biological age. So I have some 65-year-old people who are pretty much housebound and quite incapacitated, and I've got other people in their late 80s who are still very much socially interactive, you know, still out on the golf course or whatever it may be. And so there is a huge difference in the way we age, and there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that exercise and regular exercise plays an important role in maintaining a healthy longevity, because I think we're all living longer, we know that, but unfortunately the gap between longevity and healthy longevity isn't keeping up. And so many people are living their last years and sadly sometimes decades in ill health. And I'm a really strong believer that regular exercise could really change that.
We live in very different times. Both my father and mother were manual workers and did physical activity all day in a way that many tens of millions of people nowadays don't. I mean, work for me is sitting in a car, coming to a radio station, sitting in a chair and talking for 3 hours. That's not really work in the way that we used to know it. So we have to fill that gap with recreational exercise now, don't we?
You're so right. So I wrote a book earlier this year called Live Well to 101, and in writing the
I'm
book,
buying that one, Dawn.
It was a really great fun book to write, actually, because I met some amazing centenarians who were not sitting waiting for God. You know, these were people who were really still active and enjoying life and really having a positive experience of their latter years. And the very interesting thing that they had incredibly different stories, George. I mean, some were very, very poor. Others had come from very privileged backgrounds. Some lived in rural Italy. Some lived in London. You know, the very different backgrounds, but they had some incredibly striking things in common. And one of those was that they moved. And as kids growing up and their parents working, as you say, often manual work, I mean, they didn't need pedometers to make sure that they did 10,000 steps a day.
No, definitely not, no.
They couldn't get through the end of the day without doing significantly more than 10,000 steps a day. And you know, modern-day Britain certainly is what I call an obesogenic society. It's a very sedentary society, just as you've said. You know, you do put your hours into work, but most of those are not moving within your normal working day. And so we actually have to make a very conscious effort to move, which is something that generations ago would have been part of everyday life.
Imagine you've just put this great image in my mind of my mother and father with Fitbits on their wrists. Of course, there was no.
Wouldn't have been heard of, would it?
Quite so. Steps. Although I've got one on my wrist, and I do 10,000 steps or more if I can nowadays. Now, 52 hours a year is what this survey is recommending. But I mean, going out for a good walk is. I would have thought more or less obligatory and entirely free, don't you think?
And walking is a very good form of exercise for all sorts of reasons. It's good aerobic exercise. A good brisk walk is really good for you. It's also good for your bones, particularly for ladies who are more prone to osteoporosis. We'll be stressing our bones by walking. So I'm a huge fan of walking. Like you, I wear my Fitbit every day, and I find myself pacing around if I've got to the end of the day. Now I know, and I'm very active, but I know that my days in surgery. Actually, I'll get to 6:30, 7 o'clock in the evening, and I need to make a conscious effort to increase my steps to achieve those 10,000 steps. And that's purely because I'm sitting in a room, and I've got into the habit now of walking to the waiting room to call my patients in just as a way of making me move a bit more, but that's not going to achieve my 10,000 steps. And the study that we're talking about today is a big old study. This is from Miami, and it's looked at 11,000 older people and looked at their cognitive function compared to their levels of activity. And there is no question that there is a striking, significant link between those who exercise more and those who have better cognitive function. More interestingly, just reading some of the researchers' comments, and they do say that they need to do some more work. They've come across this figure of 52 hours in 6 months, but actually they're not convinced that is just that's a magical figure about the 52 hours, and they're looking into more detail about what sorts of exercises might be best for our brain. But I think as a bottom line for all of us today, moving and using our brains, so doing something challenging. My mum and dad are retired, and they do a Sudoku and a code word in competition with each other every day. And they thought that I was going to laugh at them when they told me this, because we were on holiday with them. And I said, I think that's absolutely brilliant. They're doing things just to use their brain each day, and they're maintaining their activity levels. And touch wood, at 80, they are in really great health, both mentally and physically.
Fantastic. Dr. Long, may our cognitive functions function and our 10,000 target be reached. Thank you very much indeed for joining me to discuss this terrific survey reported by Oliver Moody, the science correspondent of the Times today. Definitely well worth a read, and Dr. Dawn Harper, always well worth hearing. Tyler Durden says mainstream media in the gutter. Even deeper. See the headline. Kim Kardashian is now the prison reform expert. We'll be discussing the meeting between President Trump and Kim. Both Kims. Kim the young un and Kim the big un. It's George Galloway. I'm in for Mike Graham today and tomorrow between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. My number is 0344 499 1000. You can also email me, you can text me, and perhaps above all, you can tweet me at George Galloway at talkRADIO. The first hour has sped by. The good news is there's 2 more hours to go. Now, I was mightily impressed when my redoubtable producer, Cass, told me that she'd found at Chatham House, at the Royal Institute for International Affairs, an expert on the meeting yesterday between the giant backside and the reality TV star, the Kim-Trump meeting. Turns out, though, I, perhaps like him, was getting my Kims mixed up. We've got Dr. John Nielsen Wright, who is not just a senior research fellow for Northeast Asia at Chatham House, but a lecturer in international relations at the world's 4th best university, Cambridge University. Dr. Nielsen Wright, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
Now, of course, the big meeting with Kim is not Kardashian, but Kim Jong-un. Is it back on again, Doctor?
Well, I think the omens are pretty good, aren't they? I mean, we've had this extraordinary meeting between Kim Yong-chol, the national intelligence chief from North Korea, vice chairman of the North Korean ruling party's Central Committee. It's the highest-ranking North Korean delegate to visit the United States in 18 years. The last time was back in 2000 when Marshal Jo Myung-rok visited the United States for talks with the Clinton administration. This is really, I think, a good, positive sign. We shouldn't get ahead of ourselves, though, because even though the administration in Washington is saying, yes, we're trying to make that Singapore meeting happen, the biggest worry that I think all of us have noted is the lack of time to actually put in place a secure agreement. And we've heard from the South Koreans just yesterday that on the key issue of denuclearization, the North Koreans and the Americans are still quite a ways apart. So the devil will be in the details. I don't think it's likely that the North Koreans, I think it's extremely unlikely, if not impossible, that they would agree to the sort of immediate denuclearization that the United States has been calling for. But some sort of phased agreement, maybe. So some sort of language that could be rolled out at that meeting to satisfy both sides without creating a heart attack on the part of America's allies who worry that their interests will be sold short. All of that may make this a reality.
Now, what's caused this apparent volte-face? Is there confusion in the White House, or was the cancellation by Trump just bluster?
I think it's both, actually. I think it's a lack of any sort of strategic direction within the White House, precisely because of the mix of competing personalities. And, of course, at the very top of the system, a president who is impulsive, prone to react in ways that are not thought through. That extraordinary letter that the president, by all accounts, wrote himself, or dictated at least.
Certainly read like it.
Yes, absolutely. Extraordinary language, really. On the one hand, sort of trying to flatter Kim Jong-un, and at the same time reminding him in no uncertain terms that Trump's nuclear arsenal is bigger than Kim's, the sort of rather puerile approach to global politics that we've come to recognize on the part of Donald Trump. There was, I think, some concern on the part of the Americans that the more public rhetoric of the North Koreans deserved a riposte of some sort, but that letter was not the right way of going about it. But I think has been apparent all the way along since March 8th when Trump came out and said he was going to meet the North Korean leader, both sides see a meeting as win-win. For Donald Trump, it's a desire to be anything but Obama, to sort of distinguish himself from his predecessors by getting what nobody else has been able to get, a successful meeting with the North Koreans. But of course, Trump's notion of success is anything that makes him look good. It doesn't necessarily translate into real benefits for U.S. national security or for the security of the region. And as for Kim Jong-un, well, the payoff for him is huge, isn't it? For a North Korean leader to get an audience with the most powerful man in the world and be treated effectively as an equal, that's definitely a win. And if he can get out of this some sort of relaxation of economic sanctions, we saw the Russian foreign minister just today saying the international community should start lowering those sanctions now, ahead of the meeting. You can see why this plays well for the North Koreans.
Now, you mentioned earlier the fear you said, I think, of the allies of the United States, that their interests might be sold short. I presume you had South Korea as one of those in mind, but the South Koreans have been rather keen on rapprochement, at the very least, with the North. So, in fact, it's not perhaps the allies, certainly not them, that is holding the United States back as much as people like the new National Security Advisor, John Bolton.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think for allies of the United States, for South Korea and Japan, it's always been a bit of a kind of two-headed dilemma in a way. It's the issues, the fear of both being abandoned and entrapped by the United States. Entrapped, and this is where I think the South Korean fears are most pronounced. The worry on the part of Seoul that if there is no successful talking and dialogue, the United States will go back to the military option, and that would expose South Korea, of course, to the prospect of a devastating war, which they want to avoid. And that's why I think they've been pushing so hard for not only talks with the North on their side, but also they want the Americans to sit down with the North Koreans. And there's also a possibility that President Moon will join Kim and Trump on June 12th in Singapore if that meeting goes ahead. The country that stands to lose most from abandonment, from having its interest downgraded, is probably Japan. Because Japan worries, what sort of deal is Trump likely to make in order to make sure that this meeting is, from his point of view, a success? Trump may not be a good diplomat, but he's very good at selling whatever he does in ways that play well with his base. He might be prepared, for example, to cut American troops in the region, both in Japan and also in South Korea, a result which would, I think, be opposed by both Seoul and Tokyo. So there is a sense in which this idea that the United States will put its interests ahead of those of its allies is where this sense of anxiety is most concentrated. And that's why the details are so important. How do you get North Korea to start to dismantle its nuclear stockpile and its long-range missile capability? That's going to take years, if not decades, and will take an enormous amount of capacity in terms of inspectors and the ability to monitor North Korean compliance. Tokyo and Seoul will want reassurances that this is actually going to work and it's actually going to be carried out effectively. And of course, there will be American politicians, hopefully on both sides of the aisle, who will also be looking for that sort of reassurance. But I don't think Trump really cares. From his point of view, a successful June 12th meeting will play well ahead of the midterms in November. Will put him in a position where he can say, look, I've achieved something that nobody else has been able to achieve, and if I get a Nobel Peace Prize out of it, all the better.
Now, even Chatham House doesn't know everything, but if you could make an educated guess for me, now that they've destroyed the test site, that leaves the stockpile. What sort of stockpile are we talking about here? In other words, how nuclear armed is North Korea?
Well, there's been quite a lot of detailed work and speculation, and we think, and this is a conservative estimate, we think that the North has probably acquired enough fissile material, both plutonium and highly enriched uranium, to make anywhere between 20 and 30 crude nuclear devices. They've already done that. So they have an arsenal, we think. Whether they can deploy it meaningfully on long-range missiles is another question. We don't think they have the miniaturization technology, but we do think that they have that stockpile already. We also know that if we don't reach an agreement and they continue to reprocess, by 2030, we expect that they will have, and again, this is a conservative estimate, about 100 nuclear bombs. So that gives you a sense of the gravity of the situation.
Yes, stakes are indeed high.
Really high. And also, I think we should expect that if an agreement comes out of, or beginning of an agreement, because there will have to be lots of follow-up talks beyond June 12th, we should expect that the North Koreans will be minded to cheat. After all, if they make a commitment publicly to give up their nuclear stockpile, what is going to make them trust the United States, the country that dropped more ordnance on North Korea in the 3 years of the Korean War than was dropped on the entire East Asian theater of conflict during World War II? Every urban center north of the DMZ was wiped out in North aggression, as the North Koreans would define it, is seared into the consciousness of contemporary Koreans, both the older generation and their kids, brought up on a diet of official messaging from North Korea that emphasizes that the United States is, if not the great Satan, certainly the long-term opponent of North Korea. And a really interesting question is, if this breaks out and we have a successful meeting, how will Kim Jong-un and his leadership manage that historic image of the United States for his own people? That's a real public relations challenge for the North Koreans.
So the local McDonald's in Singapore on standby, you think, for next month?
Definitely. I think they're going to need to be rolling out the burgers, and we've just had the CIA, of course, saying, well, Kim's not going to give up his nukes, but he might just possibly be open to the idea of having McDonald's open its first franchise in Pyongyang. So,
well, that would be a win-win, because Kim looks like he likes a burger or two also. Thanks very much indeed, Dr. John Nielsen Wright, lecturer in international relations at Cambridge and senior research fellow for Northeast Asia at Chatham House. Up the stairs into the fire, Bruce Springsteen, peon of heartfelt praise for the workers in uniform who poured into the Twin Towers when everyone else was running in the opposite direction. A bit like what happened at Grenfell. I am seething with anger at Andrew O'Hagan, who exculpates the true blue Conservative leadership of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, who exculpates those whose building it was, those who decided on the cladding, cyanide-filled and utterly flammable, those who stripped bare our firefighting service and capacity in a savage way, which left these brave men and women unable to save the lives that were lost, although they saved many others. Andrew O'Hagan thinks one of the main culprits in this piece is Jon Snow, whom the Daily Mail describes as a left-wing television reporter. Jon Snow it was, you see, who invented class division in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, whose class war analysis fatally skewed the narrative in the aftermath of the towering inferno. I've no reason to doubt that Andrew O'Hagan is a very fine writer. He writes at very great length, as he has indeed again on this occasion, in the London Review of Books. I'm not sure what qualifies him as an analyst of such a disaster as Grenfell Tower. I'm not sure if he has a thing about the fire brigade. I do. I have been associated with the Fire Brigade Union since I was 21 years old, and I'm a good deal more now. And I happen to believe that our firefighters are amongst the bravest people in our land. And if they were short of essential equipment, as indeed they must have been, then the very last people to be blamed are the people who ran into the fire. Now, Kaz, you got me an expert on Kim. Can you get me an expert on Kim? You know, giant backside meets reality TV star. Can you try and get me somebody on Kim Kardashian? Because I'm keen to know when she became an expert on prison reform. Was she the only prison reform campaigner that would meet Donald Trump? I'm intrigued about the Trump-Kim summit in the White House yesterday. Daniel says, always good to find out George Galloway is on Talk Radio. Whether you agree with him or not, he's a conversation starter and always stands up for what he believes in. I always enjoy listening with my ears widely open. Thank you, Daniel. And Leonidas says, how can Jeremy Corbyn be an anti-Semite? He loves Palestinian people. And since when are Europeans from Poland Semites? I'm from Cyprus. I am Semitic. Thanks for that, Leonidas. George This is an SMS from Peter. Certain countries have tried everything to destroy the upcoming World Cup. But ask yourselves, more importantly, why do certain countries want to demonize Russia? I believe they want the Nord Stream 2 partners with Russia to pull out. Then ask yourself who benefits, and you may have an answer. As for Ukraine, I stated from the very beginning, they are top of my list to stage the Salisbury poisoning. They will stop at nothing. They are the most right-wing, fascist, neo-Nazi party since Hitler, and no one in the West is reporting the fact. Again, I wonder why. Thank you, Peter. And the communicipalist, who's a very, very fine communicator and correspondent of the show, he says Putin is the name. Vladimir Putin, licensed to keep you alive, even under the most unlikely of circumstances. And this is an SMS from a nameless one. The answer to my previous question, why no one reports the Nazi government in Ukraine, that's because the West overthrew a democratic, non-fascist government to install the present one. And Maureen on email says, George, I heard some news of the most alarming nature. I'm told you're no longer going to be broadcasting on a Friday night. Please tell me it's not true. Whatever will I do with my Friday nights now? I've learnt so much from listening to you, your guests and callers. Keep up the good work. Maureen from Worcestershire. Well, no, that's not so, Maureen. I'm just not on this Friday night because I've been on every day this week in this slot, 10 till 1. I would, of course, have been happy to do my Friday night show too, but that's not allowed here. So we've had 5 shows instead of 1 this week. Unfortunately, we're torn asunder, but only for this Friday. From next Friday, we'll be back to normal. And Rotenin Borosovsky says there is not a single day that there isn't a negative story about Russia on the BBC website. It's not all like the Babchenko story. It's often very subtle, designed to reinforce negative stereotypes that we're supposed to believe about Russia. But as Craig Murray pointed out, and I think it's one of the wonders of our age, all of my anecdotal evidence, all of it, from taxi drivers to people in the street to other parents at the school gate to correspondents to callers, texters, emailers, and tweeters from all of these people. And of course, as Craig said, the comments appended to the bottom of mainstream media articles, the British people aren't as stupid as our rulers would like us to be. George, I have a plea. Please could you tell the powers that be to keep you on a regular time slot, because I either miss you altogether or have to change my plans at the last minute, causing havoc to all and sundry. Gary Hill. Thanks, Gary. It's very flattering, I must say. I'm just a working man in my prime. I just work at where and when my employers tell me. Fra says, if you extrapolate yesterday's underhand false flag assassination into the near future, when will the Ukraine host a false flag Russophobia attack as a precursor to military intervention in the Crimea and ultimately the Caucasus? Well, Fra, if they do, it'll be the biggest mistake in all history. 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call. I'm George Galloway. I'm sitting in really, in these days of the need for more exercise. For the great Mike Graham, he'll be back next week. He's enjoying from all the tweeting and pictures he's been posting. A wonderful holiday, well-deserved, in Greece, the birthplace of democracy. 0344 499 1000. Him and the other Mike are sadly missed. The 2 Mikes are a total phenomenon. If you haven't listened to them or watched them on the 2 Mikes TV, I strongly advise you to do so. Patrick Vidine says, many people, especially in UK and USA, appear to have been programmed by the Western establishment to hate Russia and Putin. This has been a long-term project, the purpose of which I cannot understand. We would all benefit from a change of attitude. Patrick, the phrase in that, with which I agree, of course, all of it entirely, the phrase in that chimed with me most is this one, the purpose of which I cannot understand. You see, I understood it, Patrick, when the Soviet Union existed and Russia was part of a communist bloc and was therefore an existential threat to the hegemony of the Western capitalist model. But it's been quite some time, 30 years since that was true. And it's genuinely bemusing that we are endlessly exhorted to hate Russia, which is a capitalist country just like ours, and moreover, one which is located in the biggest country in the whole world, in a country that's economy is extremely important to a trading nation, to an exporter of quality products and services like we are, at a moment when we are leaving the European Union and need all the friends, or at least normal business relations, that we can get. It is genuinely bemusing why we are not able to unite with Russia against Islamist fanaticism. That genuinely beats me. We are, as we've seen in both the Netherlands and Belgium, just in the last 36 hours, under siege by the very Islamist head-chopping fanatics that Russia is destroying right at this minute in Syria. And Boris Johnson used to believe that. He used to write, very expensively, in the Daily Telegraph, the world's best paid columnist. He used to write it regularly, that we should be allied with Putin in crushing ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria and around the world. Instead, we are the backers of ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria and are apparently engaged in a kind of 1984 George Orwell world of endless conflict with Russia. And for what is what Patrick is asking. And it's what I'm asking. For what? Why? Why was it not possible when the Soviet Union collapsed, its bloc disintegrated, for all the countries of the former Warsaw Pact to be absorbed into NATO if you must have it? Why not? Why wasn't it possible to offer all the countries of the former Soviet Union membership of the EU? Why not? Why is it not possible to have normal relations with a country just like ours? Really, it's a genuine question that Patrick is asking, and I'm asking too. Daniel says, it's good to know that my walking is doing some good on my young but old-feeling bones. Well, I'm doing this 10,000 steps a day. I try to do more. It's stuff if you've not been doing it in recent years, read decades, but you quickly enough get used to it. I mean, I'm pretty fit anyway. I've lost quite a bit of weight. I've got a young wife who is determined to keep me alive, who feeds me well and healthily. I don't eat junk food. I don't eat carbs, no bread, no rice, no potatoes. The weight is falling off me and I'm getting fitter and fitter, touch wood. And I really advise every one of you out there to follow my path. I've got a good friend who used to take 3 sugars in his tea, and now he takes none because he followed my policy, and now he would never go back to it. Sugar's a very, very foolish thing. Really, it's a very childish thing. Lizzie says, I was conscious that Craig Murray didn't mention the question of there even being a Skripal attack. Well, I don't know about that. You may be reading too much into that, Lizzie. I'm certain that there was a Skripal attack. I saw the wound on Yulia Skripal's throat that made it clear she'd had emergency surgery. I must say she's recovered fantastically well. She's looking far better now than she did before the attack. And I wish her a full and speedy, complete recovery. I'm pretty sure there was an attack. And as I've said 10,000 times before, let me say it one more time. I don't know who attacked her and her father. And it could have been the Russians. It could well have been Russians. Not the Russians, but Russians. But it's more likely to me that it was somebody who wished Russia ill, who did it to cause exactly the exacerbation in pre-existing conflict between certain Western countries and Russia. And the Ukraine has now gone to the top of my list of such potential suspects. And they've only themselves to blame for that. Frank says, frightening that our media, MPs and Foreign Office can all be duped. This could on a bad day be a call to war. You're right, Frank. Boris can be concerned about imaginary murders, but ignores 3,000 innocent Palestinian demonstrators shot. More than 100 of them murdered by the Israeli army. Thank God people like you have a voice. I've dumped the London local radio station. Let's take a break. Now, Jan Halper-Hayes is indeed a pretty woman. She's a pretty good talker and very good in heart, even if she is a spokeswoman for Republicans overseas and constantly brought onto the radio by me to defend the latest outrage, which she does with such aplomb, considering she doesn't actually in her heart even really like Donald Trump. And she's back with me again today. Jan, welcome back.
Oh, hi, George. I love being with you. But what do you mean in my heart I don't like him?
Well, that's just my inference. Maybe I just want to believe that, Jan. Look, a giant backside met a reality TV star yesterday in the Oval Office. Tell us about that.
Well, I've been thinking about that because when your producer asked me to come on with you, honestly, I missed that news yesterday. And so I laughed. That was my first response.
Don't worry. So was the rest of the world, Jan.
But let's look at this from two perspectives. One is that those of us who have not watched reality TV and those of us who do not follow Kim Kardashian or even like any of that stuff, the fact of the matter is they have a very big following, and she is talking about a very important issue that actually some of the politicians, including Senator Rand Paul, have been arguing about and have tweeted in support of her. So I think that we have to set our bias or maybe our elitist intellectual attitude or whatever it is that makes us laugh or question it and really look at the fact that they have a following and can bring attention to this prison reform issue where Congress just passed a bill on it.
Well, of course, the cause itself is a good one. The optics, as they say, were peculiar. There was Kim actually standing behind the desk, the desk in the Oval Office, as if she were, for all the world, his running mate. Maybe she will be. That stranger things have happened. But as somebody pointed out on Twitter this morning, if someone had told you in 2013 that President Donald Trump would meet Kim Kardashian in the Oval Office to talk about prison reform, the chances of you believing that would have been zero. That's true, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, look, I had to go do my research before getting on with you to see how serious it was.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't take it seriously at
Well,
first.
when I saw the headline, I thought he'd brought forward his meeting with the other Kim.
You know what? I did too. And there was on Drudge, there were 2 articles, and they both had Kim in there, and I opened the wrong one.
Now, it is interesting that not many of the, let's call them the glitterati, the Hollywood A-listers are ready to break bread with Donald Trump. He's pretty unpopular in that milieu. Kanye West gets into a lot of trouble for being pro-Trump. Do you think Kim will now also?
Oh, I'm sure there'll be backlash. Absolutely. But look, there is always going to be backlash. I've known Donald Trump. I lived in New York in the 80s, when he came to great notoriety. I mean, not only just in our state, but then it went national.
I hope he never took a hold of you, Jan.
No, he never did. I never was a Studio 54 girl or anything like that. But the thing is that people have either loved him or hated him. There is no middle ground for him. And, the things that people complain about, his behavior, they are the ones, and I'm not condoning his behavior because a lot of times it's really out of line. But if we compare those who just want to criticize him and hate him and those of us who actually support him, we support him because of what he focuses on and the problems that he's correcting, that he's dealing with, that he is bringing to the forefront, that have existed for quite some time. And I just think we will always have people making fun of him, finding a way to smear him. We will continue to have more Stormy Daniels, scandals because people are, there's just such hatred as much as such love for him out there.
That's true. That dichotomy doesn't seem to trouble him all that much. Well, maybe it does. Maybe he just doesn't let it show. But finally, and I'm grateful for your time, Jan, tell me about this prison reform thing, because most people in Britain's image, if you like, of the American prison system is that it's pretty close to hell on earth. What does Congress have in mind to make it better?
Well, in terms of the prison reform and the particular woman that Kim is asking to be pardoned, the interesting thing is Obama pardoned over 1,900 people before he left office, but he didn't pardon this woman. And on Twitter there is another big issue for a man that had been released from prison because he had served his time, and then now he's having to go back after reestablishing his life for 3 years because the law said, oh, well, he was released erroneously and he was committed without a pardon, the same as his great-grandmother, 21 years, because she was an intermediary in a drug deal. So we have had rules, and maybe in states and on the federal level, that people have been sent to prison and given life sentences for the same thing, a murderer. In fact, this woman is serving the same sentence that the Unabomber is serving. Now, that is very, very unbalanced, and they're having to look at it. And Senator Rand Paul is a good person to follow on this because he has been fighting for
I'm a big admirer of his. He'd be a great president, you know.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of his, a very, very big fan of his. And here's the other thing is that because of the way the federal laws have been, the problem is that it has been discriminatory against African Americans and Hispanics. Now that separates the fact that 27% of the people in federal prisons are illegals, but we will take that aside. But that means we've got almost 75%, 3/4 of the people that we really need to review how we have put them in jail and what those sentences are and whether they really have been fair or if we're even doing good rehabilitation. Because I don't think we have focused on it properly. It has been too punitive instead of looking at ways that we can help people re-enter society. And then we have these instances where we do have rehabilitation and those people get punished.
Well, they do say orange is the new black. Jan Halper-Hayes, as always, very helpful indeed in making sense of the Trump-Kim summit meeting in the Oval Office yesterday. Thanks, Jan, for that. Neil in Lee says, George, Egypt are in Russia's group at the World Cup, and Mo Salah was cynically injured at the weekend. I bet Bojo the Clown is joining the dots as we speak. Love your show. Thank you, Neil. Brilliant communication. And here is an SMS. George, after listening to one of your callers today talking about Trump and the North Korea saga, why are you so anti-Trump and admit he's doing a good job with it? Get over the McDonald's obsession with Trump, and maybe you're jealous of him deep within your Muslim soul. It's Graham from Fort William. Oh, dear God. God save us. The communicipalist says, we live in a post-truth world where the MSM is a theatre of absurdity. Your own contribution, George, is a solitary exception. But I think the project for a new American century agenda remains the neocon vector underlying the global geopolitical crisis. Now, let me just read those last two lines to you again. This is the Open University of the airwaves. But I think the project for a new American century agenda remains the neocon vector underlying the global geopolitical crisis. Where do you hear that kind of stuff on radio? Russell says, after totting up on his abacus, Defence Secretary Sonny Boy Gavin talked down to the press from his high chair about the declining number of soldiers for his army and for the egg he had for his tea. He was very upset about this and wanted reassurance from an older person like Mrs. May. Russell, that's pure brilliance. I must say I agreed with the very understated tweet that was sent to me yesterday, which said, I'm beginning to think that the Defence Secretary of Great Britain has been rather over-promoted in relation to his abilities. Watching and listening to the epic interview by my sometime colleague and yesterday guest, Richard Madeley, of Private Pike. Don't tell him your name, Pike! It was truly staggering. Not just the obfuscation, the wriggling and squirming, not that. Other politicians do that too. It was the sheer lack of presence, intellectuality, grasp of reality. He looked to me like a fireplace salesman. He looked to me like Private Pike in Dad's army. Sorry, but that's how it seemed to me. Jason says, Kim Kardashian in the Oval Room with the spanner. Hashtag Cluedo. Yes, she was definitely up close and personal. She was dangerously close to President Donald Trump, actually. Standing, how shall I put this, cheek by jowl. Marie McFarlane says, and against Jeremy Corbyn, this was the first reaction by those looking for any excuse to vilify him. This and the hoax call about him to Boris Johnson, a new way to trigger lies rather than fake news. It was extraordinary. I mean, we once had an intelligence service that was one of the most efficient. We used to have a Foreign Office which was arguably the finest repository of diplomatic connection anywhere in the world. And twice in a week, the British Foreign Secretary was mugged. First by 2 Russians, then by the Ukrainians. Now, I do have a lot of traffic, written traffic. Darren Alevi on the email says, Hi George, Daz from Leeds. I hope you have a good Friday night off. You deserve a rest after all the hard work you do for us, fighting the mainstream media bias. Take that nice wife of yours somewhere. I'm looking forward to see the body language of the Kim and Trump summit. I think young Kim and his sister have played a blinder. I also tip my hat off to the Jeremy Corbyn of South Korea, Moon Jae. He deserves a Nobel Peace Prize. I hope one day Corbyn can meet Moon Jae-in. I agree with all of that, and I am indeed going to take my good wife out for a rare Friday night. Now, I'm finding it difficult to get anyone at all from the right to talk about the Islamophobia problem in the Conservative Party. It's funny, because if the boot had been on the other foot, and if it had not been Islamophobia but some other kind of racism and bigotry, people would have been queuing up to talk about it. I suppose that speaks volumes in itself. George, in former times, I would never have taken the side of the Soviet Union. But now with Russia, it has become ludicrous. The scaremongering, which is constantly pumped out, is never ending. I do not want another Cold War, so I ask myself why. And the only logical explanation is that to mention Russia, you can justify billions of dollars in arms sales to Eastern Europe and around the world, something ISIS does not merit. Well, up to a point, Peter. But I don't think that's the full explanation. I think it's that Russia is potentially too powerful a country. Of course, it has an enormous big stick because it is the successor state to the Soviet Union and inherited its vast nuclear strike force. It has a very, very efficient army, as ISIS and Al-Qaeda now know to their cost, if there are any of them left in Syria. It is diplomatically very powerful. It has an extremely close relationship with China, which, before we're very much older, will be the most important country in the whole world. And only a fool would gainsay that. And if you're dissing Russia, you're dissing China. If you are sanctioning Russia, you're pushing Russia closer to China. There are so many layers of illogicality in all of this that I genuinely don't understand it. Jules, that's Julie, says, "Good morning, George. Great show as usual. I'm so relieved to hear that you will be back on air covering your usual 7 p.m. slot every Friday from next week. In my view, your voice is the most intelligent, informative, and above all honest in the entire political milieu. Regards, Julie from Islington." I'm very touched by that, Julie. Thank you very much. And Chris says, "I suspected that it was Ukraine on the very day I heard about Salisbury, as they had motive for such an attack, whereas Russia did not." I think that's a really important point and powerfully made. You see, it's true that Russia had the capacity to mount the Salisbury attack. So did Ukraine. But it's true that Ukraine had a motive for doing so, whilst Russia did not. This is key, because as I said from the first moment, the idea that Russia, 100 days out from the World Cup, and involved in all kinds of international tensions, would willfully seek to gigantically exacerbate them in order to kill, or rather not kill, a superannuated third-tier traitor that they had already exchanged. And no attack on an exchanged prisoner has ever been mounted, ever, by either side in this Cold War. I fell back on the position that I'm iterating now again, and it is that whilst Russia could have done it, it is probably the least likely suspect, for reasons of that ancient Latin question, when viewing a crime, cui bono, who benefits? Russia plainly did not, could not benefit. And as I pointed out also, one of the many contradictions We keep being told what a Mephistophelian genius Putin is, that he can rig things in Michigan State, in Catalonia. He can rig the Brexit referendum. And yet at the same time, he's so stupid that he could try and fail to kill someone of zero importance, a scratch card enthusiast, in Salisbury, in broad daylight, in England. It's just not credible. Mark says, why are you in denial? The problem, as you say, is Islamic murderers making every Muslim a potential terrorist. You do not support Christians or Christianity. Allah is not God. Jesus Christ reigns, and all Muslims hate him. Learn it, George. Great show, he says, despite your contradictions and hypocrisy. Mark, I've concluded that you're a wind-up merchant. You're either the most insane man outside of Broadmoor, or you're a wind-up merchant. First of all, to say that every Muslim is a potential terrorist is exactly the same as saying every Roman Catholic was a potential terrorist at the height of the IRA's bombing campaign. It is an utterly illogical, deeply offensive, and extremely dangerous thing to say. To say that I do not support Christians when I'm the man who's demanding the crushing of ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria for, amongst many reasons, that the ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Islamist fanatic mentality is murdering Christians and destroying their holy places in Syria, as they did previously in Iraq, is again utterly illogical. To say that I don't support Christianity, I'm not even going to dignify with an answer. To say Allah is not God, Allah is the Arabic word for God, you half-wit. It is merely the expression of the word God in Arabic. And to say, Mark, that Jesus Christ reigns and all Muslims hate him shows the unfathomable, bottomless ignorance that you are displaying here. All Muslims love Jesus. All Muslims believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the capital T, Messiah, capital M. All Muslims believe that on the last day, Jesus will return as the Messiah and sit at the right hand of God. You half-wit. The mother of Jesus, Mary, is mentioned 10 times more in the Muslim book, the Quran, than she is in the Christian book, the Bible. Now, I've banned you before, but my producer keeps putting your bilge on my screen, and before I know it, I've started to read it. Although this time I'm glad I did, because I've demonstrated that you are either a hoaxer or someone who should be in a straitjacket in Broadmoor. I'm not allowed to say that anymore. Marie says, no fake news, no lies. No fake news, a.k.a. lies, on Talk Radio with George Galloway on the mother of all talk shows. Thank God we have the power to voice our informed and experiential opinions on this radio station. Experiential opinions. Ponder that phrase, listeners. And to hear uninterrupted analyses of guests, the best and most democratic network of the 21st century. Hear, hear. Let's hope the bosses are listening. Tyler Durden says, today is London History Day. I wish I'd known that. And I wish the person who normally tells me what day it is had told me that. Dana says, seems to be news reports and adverts every 10 minutes, trying to keep you quiet, George. Friday night has been cancelled temporarily. Has the censorship started? No, in the morning there's news every half hour. And if we didn't have adverts, we wouldn't have a station. And I wouldn't be talking to you and you wouldn't be listening to me. And if the adverts are becoming more salient, that's because the station is doing very well. And it's doing very well precisely for the reasons that Marie McFarlane has just stated. And I'll be back the Friday after this. And there's no censorship. Since the day and hour that I began here, nobody has ever asked me, still less told me to say something, or asked me, still less told me not to say something. Wouldn't happen on the BBC, you know. Patrick says, Mother of all talk shows wholeheartedly agree with the sentiments Galloway is voicing about Russia. There is so much to gain from a synergic relationship between the UK and Russia. Regular vacationing on the steppes, that's STEPPES, could become the norm for many who currently denigrate the country. Russia is a very beautiful country. I thoroughly disapprove of its economic and political system. I preferred the old Russia. But Russia and Russians are treasures on God's earth. And the idea that we are being locked away and being told to regard Russia and Russians as enemies is something I will never accept. Lizzie says, haha, Trump and Kim, cheek by jowl. Take a walk on the wild side with me, George Galloway, in for Mike Graham. Today and tomorrow, between 10 and 1, Daniel France has, he says, I've given up on the local radio station in London. For me, it's George Galloway at Talk Radio all the way, 10 a.m. till 1 p.m. every day this week. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Daniel France. Professor Scott Lucas is one of my favorite Americans. He's a professor of U.S. politics at the University of Birmingham. And he's here to talk about exactly what's going on in Italy, across Europe, across the political spectrum, because he's an expert on all of it. Professor Lucas, thanks for joining us again on the Mother of All Talk Shows.
Always a pleasure to talk to you, George.
Professor, it was long American policy to keep the commies out of power in Italy at the time when the Communist Party was a mighty force in Italy, and indeed when the dichotomy in Italy was between the Christian Democrats and the Communist Party of Italy, neither of which now currently exists. The US were ready to fight a war to stop the communists coming to power in Italy and Greece for that matter, and Britain did fight such a war in Greece to stop it. Now the communists are gone, the populists are here, and they are now being thwarted not by the US but by the EU. Give us an overview from your standpoint of all that, would you?
Wow. In the space of a couple of minutes, that's a heck of a task.
No, I'll give you longer.
Oh, I appreciate it. I mean, the starting point for this is almost what would be the rhetoric of populism, which is that it doesn't just come from a left-right perspective anymore. That's sort of broken down. So in Italy, you have a party called Five Star, or M5S, which starts to portray itself as coming from the left, but really would sort of like have calls, for example, like guaranteed effectively income for those who are unemployed or for the poor. It would talk, for example, about increasing the pensions, which have been under challenge in Italy as well as under other countries. Then you have the populists who come from what used to be called the Northern League, the Lega Nord, which is now just called the League, Lega, which, as the name implies, first of all started off not really as a populist party, but as much as a party which was really demanding the separation of the North from the rest of the country. Now it's reconfiguring itself as a party for all of Italy, but from more the standpoint of being firmly anti-immigration, of mainly asserting Italian national identity, so they'll have an anti-European message over the top of it. And all of those things get bracketed into populism, even though there are some very different issues that are jumbled up there. So that's the rhetoric. The reality in Italy is that the issue that is there isn't necessarily a left or right issue, but it's one that we've experienced here in Britain, which is when you're facing long-term problems over public finances, and Italy has a huge problem with its debt, when you're faced with the challenge of at that point also dealing with maintaining public services and not cutting them back, something we've seen with the discussion of austerity in recent years, how do you keep everything running? And that, I think, is really at the core of Italy, in that all the personality politics, which is there, and figures like Signor Berlusconi, for example, or the leaders of these parties, all the personality politics really is sort of shadow boxing over that question of how does Italy preserve its social services as well as having an economic future, which I don't think is outside Europe. I think there are a lot of headlines that are wrong that Italy will leave Europe, but in some ways reconfiguring its relationship within the EU.
The EU decision overtly in the Parliament this week to basically threaten the Italian voters in the mouth of the commissioner, the German commissioner, I forget his name now, who said that the markets will teach the Italians how to vote. And the, I think, covert pressure on the president of Italy not to allow a Eurosceptic, anti-Euro currency Minister of Finance almost scuppered the creation of a government at all. It looks like that might be getting back on. Is that your view?
Yeah, I think we're looking towards more of a compromise. I think the statement you referred to was ham-fisted, to say the least, from the EU. But there was a question which had come to the front, which is, while none of the parties had really campaigned first and foremost on leaving the euro, which would have significant consequences, of course, for the EU, but especially for Italy, which is still the largest manufacturing economy in Europe. Once the euro came to the fore, and then basically through Signor Savona, who was supposed to be the finance minister, everybody was like, do we want to go that far? Now, what we've got is that the Italian president has backed away from trying to go for a replacement government, what you might call technocrats. He's gone back to the two populist parties, to Five Star and to Liga, and said, okay, give me another list of ministers. And what I suspect you will have is that particular finance minister, Signor Savona, will not be in the new list, but you will still have a list of ministers that are probably more committed to, for example, the minimum wage for the poor, the pensions, the maintenance of Italy's social services, which will bring a specific issue up to the fore. And that is, will Italy be allowed to exceed the EU's restriction on debt limits? And that'll be sort of the economic issue rather than actually Italy inside or outside the EU that will follow the formation of a government.
There were two other issues, though, in their program. Well, more than two others, but two that were significant. One was on the immigration front, and I want to put this to you, as I am a man of the left. Why should Italy take such a gigantic share of refugee flows created by wars that were largely not of their making?
Oh, I think I take your question, but there's two possible answers to that. One is that you respond to it by saying that all countries that were facing this unprecedented, at least outside of wartime, crisis with refugees and migrants, including the UK, should have taken a significant share, rather than leaving the burden to follow on certain countries that said they would, such as Germany, and then the entry points for much of these migrants, for example, Italy and Greece. But the answer which is being given by Five Star and by Liga is much different, and that is not that they try to find an arrangement to continue to deal with these people who have been displaced by civil conflict and almost, in a sense, man-made disaster, but simply to send them back to where they came from. And we're talking about 500,000 immigrants who are at risk. I don't think Italy would move to have a mass expulsion of immigrants, but I do think that harder line stance, which has been taken in conjunction with certain other governments, especially in Eastern Europe, does mean that this problem of how we deal with millions of people who really have nowhere to go at this point, it's sort of like you try to pass it on to someone else, which, of course, is going to be a solution for no one.
Well, especially as the someone else won't take them. I mean, Britain has been integral to the creation of mass refugee flows as a leading edge participant in virtually every conflict that has stricken these parts of the world, but takes virtually no refugees in the small number of thousands, while Italy, a poorer country than us, are expected to take many, many hundreds of thousands.
I mean, George, we're starting to talk about issues that cross into what's happening in the Middle East. When you talk about, for example, the Syrian crisis, with the government there bearing a great deal of responsibility for millions who are displaced, where we talk about the crisis in Yemen, where Saudi Arabian intervention has basically furthered the displacement of people in that country, or, for example, even displacement of people from Libya before that. I absolutely agree with you on the point that Britain should take more refugees. It's not going to happen. What happens instead, and this is where I think the EU has a further issue to deal with beyond Italy, is you sort of leave them in places like Turkey. Turkey now has more than 3 million refugees, and you, in effect, agree to a financial arrangement with the Turks, giving them billions of euros if they continue to hold those refugees. So what we're having is this sort of, in practice, people are saying, you know, not only do we not want immigrants here, but we'll sort of pay you if you take them off our hands. It's not going to solve anything. But the fact of the matter is that we're in a 21st century which, far from being post-Cold War and settling lines, is we're dealing with conflicts in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, in North Africa, where we either have to accept that collective responsibility has to be taken up and not just put it on, onto one scapegoat, or otherwise we simply are going to be seeing a repetition of these disasters for generations to come.
Professor Scott Lucas, Professor of US Politics at the University of Birmingham, grateful as always for your wisdom and your time. Sorry I ran that a little longer. I was momentarily distracted and indeed entranced by the voice of the master, the very, very great Bob Marley. Fra says, we have no free press, George, just a compliant cabal of converging interests to manipulate the public narrative, to manufacture consensus for endless war. Human life is a disposable commodity that gets in the way of war profits, financial resource exploitation. And Mark in Lowestoft says, why the big surprise, George? Trump said exactly the same as Boris about getting together with the Russians to smash ISIS once and for all. But the deep state on both sides of the Atlantic, I didn't vote for them, he says, have said no. Both governments covertly give a lot of cash to the head choppers to overthrow Assad. But those damned Ruskies paid to that. All the best, Gigi, says Mark in Lowestoft. Very, very well observed, my friend. Sam Cole says, it takes George Galloway on talkRADIO to discuss Islamophobia in the Tory party, whilst the local London radio station is defending Netanyahu and calling Corbyn's party anti-Semitic. You couldn't make it up. And Fra again says, I phoned in twice recently about Israel's new proposed prison sentences for NGOs, individuals and press who highlight via photography and video Israel's human rights violations and possible war crimes. I know it's part of the, but I know it's not part, he meant to say, of the current topics under discussion. And Nat Kimber says, I have met many Muslims and they hate terrorism as much as I do. As a matter of fact, the Muslims are the biggest victims of Islamist fanatic terrorism. Some idiots don't seem to know that. Now, Lizzie says, haha, good to hear you lose it again over escapees from Ward 5. Sad you can't mention their mental stability. We'll have to come up with an alternative scenario. We will indeed, Lizzie. You could say what you like, but I can't on that particular subject. The Queen Vic says, why don't they celebrate Christmas then? Oh dear. You lose the will to live. This is from Sharon in response to the point I made about God and the Arabic word for God being Allah. Why don't they celebrate Christmas then? You have to realize, George, people are just resentful of governments allowing unfettered immigration and our culture and voices being drowned out due to PC. PC has come about due to the EU, in my opinion. English are fearful of how the UK is going, and Islamification of London doesn't make us loons or racists. Well, Sharon, it may not make you a racist, but it definitely makes you a loon, because I have never seen in a single email a larger entanglement of non sequiturs as you've just sent me. Steve Gray says, breath of fresh air listening to Speech Radio and George Galloway on talkRADIO this week in the daytime whilst on the road working. Thank you for that, Steve Gray, and drive safely. Andrew says, Dear George, is there anyone in the cabinet competent to do their job? It would seem that May is surrounding herself with idiots for her own aggrandisement. I'm not sure if it's for her own aggrandisement, but because I've lived a long time, don't forget Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister when I was born, though don't tell the wife she thinks I'm 45. Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister when I was born, and at a young age, I understood politics very well because my parents were political people, and politics was the kitchen table subject for discussion. And therefore, by the time I was 9, when Sir Alec Douglas Hume was the Prime Minister, or even slightly earlier, I recall the Profumo scandal very well. John Profumo was the Minister for War, as we used to call them in those days. Imagine if Gavin Williamson was called the Minister for War. Private Pike, don't tell him your name, Pike. Gavin Williamson, Minister for War. Wouldn't cut much of a dash, would he? Anyway, I remember the Profumo affair very well, and that being a big topic of discussion. And therefore, I remember well the government of Alec Douglas Hume that succeeded Macmillan. And I remember the cabinet of Harold Wilson, 64, 66. I even remember the cabinet of Edward Heath in 1970. The point I'm trying to make to you is, in my long political life, I have never known a collection of nonentities to rival the cabinet which governs us today. Entirely forgettable. If you saw them on the bus, you wouldn't recognize them. If I told you their names would mean nothing to you. And all led by Ma Baker herself. Theresa May, mediocrity personified. Now, I tried everywhere to get someone to talk to me about the Tory party inquiry into Islamophobia. Nobody wanted to do so. Not even the most brazen of the usual suspects, the people that would be, well, demonstrating in Parliament Square if the bigotry in hand was of a different character. Even the hatchet job shock jock journos wouldn't talk to me about it. And yet, there are almost 2 million Muslims in Britain, and their leaders feel that they are subject to relentless, I think the phrase is weekly, attacks, bouts of Islamophobic abuse and discrimination. In the Conservative Party, Baroness Varsi was very vocal about that, and she was in the Tory cabinet. And at the hands of Tory councillors and MPs, the leadership of the Muslim community in Britain feels that there's an endemic, inherent, incipient phobia about Muslims in their party. I couldn't get a Tory to talk about it, but I've got a Labour man, at least a former Labour man, a man who used to work in Parliament, but he's best known nowadays as both the author of A United Ireland and also one of the best talkers on the mother of all talk shows. He's Kevin Marr, and he joins me now. Kevin, welcome.
Hiya, George. How are you doing?
Good, sir. Why do you think the normal people who are always razor sharp on the issue of systematic discrimination against people on the basis of their ethnic or religious backgrounds don't want to talk about Islamophobia in the Tory party?
I mean, it's very disappointing that anybody would try and dodge the column on this one, George, because as you say, bigotry, discrimination, casually stupid assumptions about people's ethnicity and religion, there's no place really in our politics. But we do seem to soft pedal, I think, with issues around Islamophobia. I mean, the letter that's been written today by the Muslim Council of Britain, which represents 500 ordinary Muslim community groups around the country, by its Secretary-General Haroon Khan, to the Tory party chairman Brandon Lewis. I mean, when you read this letter, this is a perfectly reasonable letter. It's raising issues about a kind of casual culture of Islamophobia that the Conservative Party, and I dare say other parties too. I'm not hammering the point with the Tories here necessarily, but there are issues there. There are issues that have been brought to light by the media in recent days and recent weeks, and they need to be addressed. They need to be dealt with. And the letter that he's written, just makes a very simple point that, the Tory party should commit to an independent review of Islamophobia in the party. That there clearly is some. Baroness Barsi, the first Muslim woman cabinet minister under David Cameron, of course, she thinks so as well. So clearly there is an issue. It calls for a programme of education and training so that these kind of lazy caricatures can be challenged and people can avoid falling into error, quite frankly. And that the Tory party publishes a list of recent incidents, and the action that has been taken to deal with them. Now, I think that's, frankly, a perfectly reasonable ask, if you like, from a group like the MCB. And, I mean, it makes the point. I mean, I'll just read this very, very short line. Our democracy should not be overshadowed by a divisive culture within political parties that scapegoats minorities and alienates some who share similar political positions. I think it makes the point. There are very many Muslims that vote Conservative. The majority don't, but there are obviously significant portions that do. And it just strikes me as extraordinarily stupid in an electoral system to go about alienating, as you say, upwards of 2 million voters in this country. So really, it's over to the Tory party to do something.
It is, and unfortunately, we've not been able to tempt any of them to discuss it. And of course, we know, don't we, that if people feel alienated from a system, from a society, then a portion of the alienated will drift onto the rocks of extremism and even violence. It's extraordinarily stupid from that standpoint too. If you want to make people feel that they're included in your society, well, you need to treat them with respect, don't you?
Absolutely, and it's not merely words. I mean, Brandon Lewis, who's the newish chairman of the Conservative Party, should perhaps be given the benefit of the doubt this morning. He's published a code of conduct recently in the local elections for their MPs and members and councillors to abide by. So, perhaps he will come onto your show later on, George. Who knows? But it's deeds rather than words here, and I think there's some evidence we've seen in recent weeks, particularly around social media, and it's so easy for people, of course, to kind of either through sins of omission or commission to sign up to all kinds of crazy websites or to retweet stupid remarks and what have you. And really, this needs kind of calling out, and we need a culture in our politics that sort of says don't scapegoat minorities of whatever character, because as you say, the more you push people out of the political mainstream, the more you push them into the hands of people who've got a more nefarious agenda, and we can't have that. And the vast majority of decent, law-abiding Muslims in this country, the overwhelming majority who wish to participate in our politics and do so, increasingly at every level in political life, should not have to face, the kind of casual, snide remarks or stupid retweets or Conservative MPs sharing platforms with Hindu nationalists that scapegoat all Muslims as jihadists and what have you, which is the issue we're dealing with, I guess, with Bob Blackman, the Tory MP for Harrow East this morning. We need a culture where there is genuine respect, that some of these issues are just taken off the table, and anybody that deliberately tries to scapegoat and wind up these often very difficult situations is dealt with by their parties. And this morning we're talking about the Tory party. In other times we might be talking about the other parties. But the issue here is with the Tories today, and it's up to them to show that, as I say, it's deeds rather than just words. It's not just a case of publishing codes of conduct. It's about cracking down on people who clearly breach those codes of conduct.
It's particularly stupid, as you inferred, because on the face of it, Muslims would be a likely growth area for support for the Tory party. A fantastic number of Muslims in Britain are small and medium-sized business people, and some are even very big business people. Muslims are, by and large, small c, conservative people on moral issues, family issues, and so on. You would have thought that the Tories would have seen that as a target area for electoral growth, rather than gratuitously kicking them in the teeth.
Yeah, absolutely, George. I mean, you would think that they would be making much stronger overtures. Especially, of course, as you've got a Muslim Secretary of State, Home Secretary no less, in Sajid Javid, who sits around the cabinet table, and as I say, the first I think I'm right in saying the first woman.
Yes, she was Baroness Warsi, yeah.
Sayeeda Warsi. So at times they've kind of made these overtures, but you've got to continue to do that, and the kind of reactionary rump of the Tory party shouldn't be allowed to dictate the terms upon which one of the main political parties in this country is seen to deal with one of the largest minority groups in this country, and they're cutting their nose off to spite their faces.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a lot of potential there to make electoral inroads, but that won't happen unless they show in deed as well as word that there is no place for Islamophobia in their party.
Well said, Kevin Marr. Particularly grateful to you today, Kevin, for helping us out with that, given that nobody else would. Kevin Marr, author of A United Ireland. The Essex Socialist says this country has always been multicultural. My own father was a migrant, and there have always been those that hate these migrants wherever they come from. Tell Sharon that. And a London local radio station logo says, I'm interested in this diet you follow, George. Is there a name for this diet? Maybe the George Galloway diet book coming out next. I just avoid carbs, that's all. Mark Challoner says, Angela Merkel allowed millions into Europe, George. Why should we take immigrants we know nothing about? It doesn't take a genius to work out that many fleeing ISIS fighters will be amongst these immigrants, asking for trouble. Well, I think you're confusing the word immigrant and the word refugee. Every country has the right to decide how many immigrants it wants to come into its country, and indeed who they should be. And that's true for us. It's true for every country. But every country has a legal and moral responsibility to accept refugees, and especially the countries that are creating the refugee flow in the first place.